All right. So thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Stephanie Osnes. I am a program developer for Dancing Sky Area Agency on Aging, and we are a program of the Northwest Regional Development Commission. If you're not familiar with us, Dancing Sky serves 21 counties through the West Central and Northwest part of the state. And our main goal really at Dancing Sky is to have our older adults remain in their home and in charge of their choices for as long as possible. And so one of the ways that we like to do that is to have webinars and have some webinars and some education brought to our community members and our providers that we serve. And so this will be a little bit informal. You can put your questions in the chat and I will monitor that. Or you can take yourself off of mute as Carrie is reading or talking through her presentation and yeah, talk about what you might want. So today, again, we're here to talk about isolation and why it matters. And we have Carrie Henning-Smith here, and I will let her introduce herself. So thank you, Carrie, for being here today, and I will let you take the floor.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I am delighted to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see, are you seeing that? Thank you. Good. I am on the faculty of the School of Public Health. I also help to lead the University of Minnesota Rural Health Research Center and the University of Minnesota Rural Health Program. I sort of live and breathe rural health in the work that I do, and a lot of my work is focused on aging and older adults and quality of life for older adults in rural places. But my very favorite thing to research and think about and talk about is social well-being, and isolation is really the flip side of that, but that's what we're talking about today. And I think you're all here because you know that social well-being is important and you care about it. I also want to recognize that many of you in the jobs that you have and the roles that you occupy are much closer to this work than I am. I research this on a national level, sometimes on a state level, but I have so much appreciation for people doing the work on the ground to actually bring people together and connect people. So I hope that, as Stephanie said, this can feel informal. You can interrupt me, you can share ideas, share thoughts, and we should have a little time at the end for some discussion. I'd love to hear what's working and what's not working in your own work as it relates to social well-being.
So Aaron.
I want to start just acknowledging various funders who have supported some of the work that I'll be talking about today, largely the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy, but also some other agencies. And here's where we're headed today. I'm going to talk about what social isolation is. I'll also talk about loneliness and some of these other terms that we throw around a lot. And then I'm going to talk about why isolation matters for health. And then I want to talk about why we need to think about isolation and social well-being in a rural context. I know many, but maybe not all of you live and work in rural places. And I'm going to argue that we need to think about social well-being differently depending on the geographic context that we're in. And so that will be a lot of my focus today. And then I'm going to end with what we can do about isolation on an individual level, on a community level, and on a policy level, and hopefully by hearing some of your ideas about what we can do and what we should do. So what is social isolation? Some of this might be news that you already have, things that you already know, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page as we go forward. Social isolation is often thought of as an objective measure, looking at a lack of social contacts, relationships, or support, simply not having people in one's life that you can turn to when you need connection, when you need help, when you just need relationship. It means having few family, friends, and other people in your life, few people to connect with or turn to. I also want to point out I'm a big dog lover, and you're going to see a few dog photos sprinkled throughout just to try and make this a little more interesting for you. Hopefully that helps. So what is loneliness? We often talk about isolation and loneliness kind of together without disentangling what both of those mean. If isolation is this objective lack of people in one's life, loneliness is really the subjective feeling or state of being alone, separated or apart from others. Means that you have an imbalance between the amount of social contact that you want and the actual social contact that you have. I want to acknowledge that loneliness is going to look and feel a little bit different for everyone. And so from a research perspective, this gets kind of messy to talk about. Isolation is easier to measure in some ways. We can have people actually count up how many friends they have in their life that they can count on, how many family members they can count on. Loneliness, everyone has a different threshold, and some people really don't need a ton of social contact to have their social needs met. Some people, more extroverted people, need quite a bit of social contact to feed their soul, to have that energy and find their sense of social well-being. So this is going to differ a little bit for each person. And so when we talk about this, if you're writing about this for a program you're putting together or for a grant, in my work, writing about this in research, there's not one perfect definition of social well-being. Social isolation, social connectedness, loneliness, and even living alone are all related constructs, but they're all distinct from each other. And as I said on the last slide, there really is a difference between loneliness and solitude. This is something that we can come back to later in the webinar today, but solitude can be a really positive thing. Being alone and being okay being alone, enjoying one's own company, enjoying some quiet, some peace, that can be a really positive thing. Loneliness is when you're alone or perhaps even with other people, but simply not feeling like your social needs are being met. So again, just to review as a shorthand here, social isolation is talking about a lack of social connections, and loneliness is talking about whether or not your social needs are not being met. Here's a quote that I really like. The current US Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, has really taken on isolation and loneliness as his passion area. You may have seen he recently issued a Surgeon General's warning about loneliness because he is so concerned about how widespread this is. And he describes it really well. Here is a way that he described loneliness in a recent interview in The Guardian. He said, loneliness is like hunger and thirst. It's a natural signal our body sends us when we're lacking something we need for survival. In this case, social connection. I just want to pause on this quote and reflect on a couple of things here. First, there's quite a bit of stigma around loneliness, around admitting that you're feeling lonely. This is something that we have built up to have shame or embarrassment around. I like the way that this quote destigmatizes this. We don't stigmatize hunger. We don't stigmatize thirst. If someone is hungry, if someone's thirsty, we recognize that that's a need that needs to be met. And we recognize that there's a solution for that, having something to eat, having something to drink. I'd like us to get to the same point with loneliness, where there's no stigma in admitting that your social needs are not being met, either in the moment or long term, and finding that solution. If you're feeling lonely, what you need is social connection. So I really, really like this quote for that reason. So I want to talk about why this matters. Why, as a researcher in the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota, am I concerned about isolation and loneliness? Why should all of you be thinking about this in your daily lives or in the work that you do? And hopefully you're convinced that it matters just because it matters, because it's common sense that social well-being is a part of quality of life and of a rich and fulfilling life. But it also matters because it has direct implications for health and health outcomes. Being lonely or being socially isolated, especially for a prolonged period of time, comes with an increased risk of a whole bunch of outcomes that we try to avoid in health and social services. Those include Alzheimer's disease and poor cognitive functioning, poor immune system functioning, hypertension and heart disease, stress, substance use, depression, and mortality. Mortality can come from suicide, but it can come from a variety of other causes, including some of the health outcomes that I listed here. And we as a society have put a lot of resources and energy into addressing at least some of these health outcomes here. I would like us to get to a point where we're putting that much energy into addressing these underlying causes, including social well-being and a need for connection. I think it's just incredibly important. I see a question in the chat. Will you get a copy of the slides? I'm very happy to share the slides. I can send them to Stephanie, and hopefully she can share them out with all of you.
Yes, we will upload the recording and these slides to our website, and I will send that out to all registrants also.
Great. Thank you. That's wonderful. So sometimes in the work that I do, I talk a lot about policy and policy implications, and sometimes it's not enough to just describe the health outcomes. I wish that it were, but sometimes I need to attach a dollar amount, a cost to that. And thankfully, there's more and more work being done to try and understand the cost in dollar amounts of social isolation. And here, I think that this figure is really salient for our conversation today because so many of you work in aging services. This is a study that was done by AARP to try and understand the cost of social isolation to the Medicare program. This is a few years old at this point, but still really relevant today. And what AARP found was that social isolation on its own is costing Medicare nearly $7 billion annually. It's more costly in Medicare expenditures than arthritis and similar to high blood pressure, things that we put a lot of resources into addressing. You can see in the figure here that the additional monthly cost to Medicare, to the Medicare program, for an enrollee who's socially isolated, that is, does not have enough contacts in their life, is an additional $134 a month. So if the quality of life and the health argument are not persuasive enough, hopefully the cost argument is enough to get the attention of policymakers and people with resources to pay attention here. So how common is isolation and loneliness? Unfortunately, extremely common. There are a lot of studies, a lot of surveys being done on this, and I could spend hours just going through those. I'm not going to do that today. I hope you take my word for it that this is common, but I'll share just a couple of data points that I think are helpful. This is from a 2021 survey of Americans conducted by the health insurance company Cigna. And in this survey, they found that 58% of Americans are considered lonely, and that 42% of people aged 18 to 34 report always feeling left out. Some of the highest rates of loneliness and isolation in these national surveys are found among younger adults. That raises all sorts of concerns for what that means for them today. It also raises concerns from a life course perspective. What does that mean as those lonelier and more isolated younger adults age into middle age, into their prime working years, into older adulthood? What does that mean for their health? What does that mean for society and the ways that we've connected with one another? The one thing I want to reflect on here, though, despite it being a bad news story that this is relatively common, is that I hope knowing that loneliness and isolation are common can help us to address some of the stigma. In other surveys and in other research, most people will experience loneliness at some point in their lives. I'm guessing that if everyone on this call were honest, most of us would admit that we've felt lonely at one point or another. And starting to admit that, starting to talk about that out loud helps to chip away at some of that stigma we have and helps to actually build connections. So that's part of why I think it's important to talk about how widespread this is so that people feeling loneliness, people feeling isolation at the moment don't feel alone in their being alone, so that they know that there are others experiencing the same thing. And I talked about my concerns about younger adults, but there are unique risk factors for older adults as they relate to social isolation and loneliness. You all could probably rattle these off better than I could, but I just want to name a few of these in our conversation today. Older adults, as you know, experience multiple life transitions. It's a season of change, or many seasons of change. Older adulthood spans over many decades for many people, but it includes retirement. It might include moving. It might include adult children or family members moving away. It might include change in marital status. Often, unfortunately, older adulthood is accompanied by loss of friends and loved ones. There are periods of grief and loss. For many older adults, there are changes in health and functional status as we age. One of those that I especially want to call out is hearing loss. Certainly not all older adults experience hearing loss, but many do. And hearing loss is a big risk factor for feeling lonely. Perhaps you've seen this in your own work or in your own lives. Even if you're at a social event, but you can't hear what's happening, it's very easy to feel disconnected and to feel lonely. I like pointing that one out because I think we have solutions there. There are things we can do, and it's something that can be acted on. And then I also think ageism is a really unique risk factor for older adults. If people are being excluded or not welcomed, included, or valued in their communities, that can certainly increase feelings of isolation and loneliness. Here is a study from the University of Michigan looking at how often older adults were reporting that they felt isolated. This is adults ages 50 to 80 over the years of the pandemic. So you can see that we really had a spike in June of 2020. If you put yourself back in that mindset of where you were in June of 2020, something I really don't like thinking about. I'm guessing a lot of us felt isolated almost because we had to be to keep each other safe and to keep ourselves safe. Thankfully, those feelings of social isolation have declined somewhat in the years since, but we're still seeing in this survey that more than a third of older adults are reporting being socially isolated. So I've been talking in big generalizations here, but there's not an equal risk of social isolation and loneliness across the population. And there are different things that pose different risks for people. Headline here is from an op-ed that I wrote early on during the COVID-19 pandemic when suddenly everyone was talking about isolation and loneliness. I was really excited to see that, but what was missing from the conversation was a discussion about equity and about how risks were not equal across the population. We know from research that there's a higher risk of social isolation and loneliness for people who have chronic health conditions and disability, for people who live alone, especially not by choice, and also for people who face different structural barriers to connectivity, things like transportation barriers, technological barriers, maybe not having broadband access, maybe not having a cell phone, not being able to get on Zoom. It's not lost on me that we're having this conversation virtually today. We also know that some of our isms and phobias in society perpetuate isolation and loneliness, things like racism, homophobia, transphobia, and xenophobia. And certainly people experience different access to care and different support resources, which can impact someone's risk of isolation and loneliness and can also impact someone's risk of negative health outcomes if they're feeling isolated and lonely. So I want to bring this back. I've been talking in kind of lofty, abstract terms. I want to put this in really tangible terms in what's probably a pretty superficial example here, but I want to walk you through this. This is from my own life and thinking about why it's important to think about isolation and loneliness in geographic context, why we have to understand where someone lives to fully understand isolation and loneliness. The map on the left here shows the upper Midwest, and all the purple dots are different places where I've lived at various times in my life. The arrow is going to a picture of a home that I lived in when I was a very little kid. I lived in a mobile home in Dubuque, Iowa, on a quiet cul-de-sac. There were a lot of structural things that helped to promote my own social well-being here. For one thing, there were a lot of families that lived in this cul-de-sac, so there was kind of a village model to raising kids there. I could go outside and there would always be someone to play with. It was also a quiet street. It was easy and relatively safe for me to go outside without worrying about traffic. It didn't take much to connect with other people socially. There I am on my stoop with some of my buddies. I'm the one on the right with the curly hair. Not long after living in this house in my older elementary years, I moved to this dot on the map in southern Wisconsin. And maybe it's a little hard to tell from the picture, but I went from having dozens of kids around me to having no neighbors whatsoever. And moved from being on a very quiet cul-de-sac to living on the intersection of two county roads, two rural county roads. And those of you who live in rural areas know what those county roads can be like. The traffic moves pretty quickly. It was not a safe place for me to walk or bike around. And in order to have social well-being, in order to connect with other people, I needed to rely on the help of others. I was really lucky to have parents who had the time and the resources to be able to drive me places or to have friends come and visit me in my house. But it really fundamentally changed the way that I went about my social life. So this is a pretty superficial example, but I want you to think about the ways that this might relate to the clients and the older adults that you work with. What are the ways that our communities and our housing and our neighborhoods are either uh, facilitating social contact or making it more challenging? And what are the resources that people need to be able to connect with others in the places that they live? So what does all of this that I've been talking about mean for rural areas? I'm going to walk through a variety of the risk factors that I talked about earlier and make an argument that they are more prevalent and more salient in rural areas. For starters, disability rates are higher in rural areas. Living alone is also more common in rural counties than in urban counties. Just about 15% of all households in rural areas are people living alone. This is from a policy brief that we wrote at the Rural Health Research Center that goes into great detail about who it is that lives alone and where this is happening. But we also found in this policy brief that the disability rates are highest among rural adults living alone. And that's a population that has particularly high risk for social isolation and is important to pay attention to. I'm sure I don't need to tell all of you that there are distinct rural transportation challenges that can make connectivity difficult. Things like infrastructure, the geography, the topography of communities, accessibility of public transportation, or even in the availability of public transportation. Is there public awareness and public support to resource transportation? And do people have financial resources, either on a community basis or individual basis, to access the transportation that they need? All of these things put together make it sometimes more challenging for people living in rural areas to physically get together to see one another, to connect socially. Can also be more challenging for people in rural areas to virtually get together and to connect. Broadband access is a long-standing challenge in rural areas. Thankfully, there have been huge investments in bolstering the broadband landscape in recent years, but we know that we're still not there yet. There's still a long way to go to make sure that we have digital equity in rural spaces. And broadband alone is not enough to bridge this gap. It might be that your community has access to high speed, reliable, and affordable broadband, but you still need a device with which to use it and to access it. You still need to be able to afford that device, and you still need to know how to use that device in a meaningful way. And I think we have a long way to go, especially for some of the older adults living in rural areas, to make sure that they have access to and the ability to connect virtually if they want, if they choose. For some people, connecting virtually just doesn't work and does not fulfill that social need. For others, it can be a really effective tool. We also have issues with access to care in rural areas. One example of that are rural hospital closures. This map shows the yellow dots are places that have lost a rural hospital since 2010. I could show you a variety of other health services. I could put up here a map of rural healthcare workforce shortages. And it would tell a similar story, and that is that in many rural places, it's more challenging to access the care that you need in a timely and affordable manner. That means for people who are struggling with isolation and loneliness and the health impacts that come with it, might be harder to get the care that you need to prevent the worst of the health outcomes I mentioned earlier. And I just want to give one quick caveat here. I've been talking about rural as if it's this one big thing, but all of you know rural areas are not monolithic. There's incredible diversity across every dimension: racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, agricultural, occupational, et cetera, when it comes to rural areas. This map here is one example of that. This map shows the majority racial or ethnic group in each of the rural counties. And you can see with variation in the color that the majority racial or ethnic group varies from one rural county to another. But we could show maps of all sorts of different dimensions of identity and diversity, and the same thing would show up. What's important to note about this is that the solutions for isolation and loneliness might differ from one rural community to another, and they're also going to differ from one rural individual to another, from one older adult to another. And because of that, we need a variety of different solutions. It's not a one size fits all kind of problem. So if you will bear with me here, I'm going to run through a little bit of data. I'm a researcher, and this is the world that I live in. But then I'm going to get to some of the, I think, juicier bits where we can talk about what some of the solutions are, and what some of the really nuanced issues are. But I want to start just with a few statistics. So what do the data say about rural-urban differences in social isolation and loneliness for older adults? We did a study using a national survey to understand the differences in rates of older adults saying that they were socially isolated, saying that they were lonely by rural and urban location. And here's what we found, breaking older adults up between urban counties, micropolitan rural counties. Those are those counties with in a city, a town of 10,000 people or more, but generally the counties don't have more than 50,000 people living in them. And then non-core rural counties. Those are the least populated rural counties, those places with fewer than 10,000 people living in them. What we found is that older adults in rural counties, especially older adults in non-core rural counties, reported that they had the most family members in their lives. They were the most likely to say that they had more than 20 close relatives, people that they could turn to in their family. But it wasn't just family. We found that rural older adults in both micropolitan and non-core counties were more likely to say that they had a lot of friends. They were more likely than urban older adults to say that they had more than 20 friends in their life who they could turn to, who they could count on. This is really a good news story of a strong social fabric among older adults in rural communities. And this is something that's shown up in other research showing strong social networks and strong social cohesion in rural areas. But using the same survey data, asking older adults, those same older adults, about whether or not they felt different dimensions of loneliness, we found something really concerning. We found that older adults in rural areas, especially in non-core rural areas, were more likely to say that they were feeling lonely. They were more likely to say that they felt isolated, left out, or that they lacked companionship. The highest here, the biggest difference that we saw was in older adults in rural non-core counties saying that they felt left out often or some of the time. What this tells me, these feel like counterintuitive findings where people have more people in their life, they have stronger social networks, they're less socially isolated, and yet they're more lonely. This tells me that we have a fundamental disconnect between our social fabric, our social relationships, and being able to act on those, being able to actually connect with people. And I think this comes back to some of the structural barriers I mentioned earlier, things like transportation and technology and places to gather, opportunities to gather. If we can bridge that divide, I think we would go a long way toward addressing social well-being for older adults in rural places. As part of the work that we've done at the Rural Health Research Center, we've also done a series of key informant interviews talking with people across the country who live and breathe social well-being and social connectedness in rural places in the work that they do. We did 22 in-depth interviews with people to understand the challenges and the opportunities that they saw related to addressing social well-being in rural places. And I'm going to just briefly walk you through some of the challenges that they identified. I hate focusing just on challenges. I think it makes it sound like a real deficits lens, and there are so many assets that we have to build on. But understanding what some of the challenges are gives us a good starting point for what we can do and what assets we need to build on to address these challenges. So when we talked with these experts about what is it that makes social connectedness challenging in rural places, we heard 5 different themes. We heard about transportation, technology, demographics, access to resources, and rural culture, which I'm putting in quotes because there's not one rural culture, but I'm going to come back to that in just a minute and explain what I mean by that. I'm going to walk through each of these briefly, and then I promise after that we're getting to some of the solutions and some of the good part of this presentation. But first, transportation challenges. This was the thing that we heard about most frequently from the people, the experts that we talked with. And then we heard a lot about having limited transportation resources and infrastructure and how that makes social connectedness, social contact, social connection challenging. We heard about long distances between people and providers to events, long distances to resources. Here's a quote from someone who works on social programming in a rural area focused on recent immigrants. And this person said to us, "Our bus doesn't run on Sundays." So you're losing that whole weekend day that you could say, hey, we're going to have a big picnic at the park, because then you have to figure out who's coming and who needs rides, and the logistics are really, really hard. When we get to time for discussion, I'd love to hear which of these quotes resonate with each of you and if you've experienced some of these challenges yourself. The next thing we heard about was technology. We heard a lot about limited internet, broadband access, and limited cellular connectivity in rural places. We also heard a lot about more restricted access to devices and resources compared with people in urban places. Here's a quote from someone who worked on social programming for older adults in rural places, much like many of you. And they said to us, "We have this great idea going out, but we can't do it for people in the smaller communities because there's no internet access. There are no cell signals in the area. There are certain places where there are dead spots, and that's where people live." We also heard a lot about demographics and how that impacts social fabric of communities and social well-being. We heard about many rural communities having an aging population, and we heard about younger people moving out of rural areas into urban areas. I just want to say, as an aside, that's not true for all places. And right here in Minnesota, have seen an influx of younger and middle-aged adults into many rural communities. Maybe some of you are part of that influx, or you've seen that in your own communities. But on average, across the country, we do have aging populations in rural areas, and we do have fewer young people in rural areas compared with urban. As a result of that, families are more geographically distant from one another than they used to be, and that really disrupts social relationships. We also heard a lot about poverty in rural places and lower incomes for many rural residents, and that can make affording the resources and just affording the time to connect with one another socially more challenging. And finally, we heard a lot about increasing racial and ethnic diversity in rural communities and how that can be a really positive thing to infuse some vibrancy and some new life into rural communities. But on the flip side of that, we heard from the experts we talked with that some of the rural communities they were working with had limited availability of culturally and linguistically appropriate services and opportunities for those recent immigrant populations. That can make social connectedness for those specific individuals more challenging. It can make them feel more isolated, and it can disrupt the social fabric of our communities. So, thinking about ways that our communities can be inclusive and welcoming and offering programs and opportunities that work for everyone is really important. We also heard a lot about access to resources, not surprisingly. Here we heard about fewer formal programs and gathering spaces. Some people described that there might be a good idea, but there just wasn't a great place to hold an event or to hold a gathering. Some of this was because of lower population density. It just wasn't the tax base or the population base to support some of the resources that were needed. We also heard a lot about healthcare constraints and workforce shortages and fewer available volunteers. I'm sure some of you deal with this in the work that you do. A lot of the programs, the events, the activities that can be really helpful for social connectedness rely on volunteers, but if we don't have the volunteer base in communities, it's hard to make those happen. It's hard to pull those off on a shoestring budget. Here's a quote from someone who was talking with us about resources and about access to services. This person works as an EMT in a rural community and said to us, "As an EMT, I've gone on a lot of 911 calls because they didn't have anyone else in their life. I don't know how many runs I've gone on that are caused by loneliness, but it's more than you would think." And finally, I promised that I would come back to this idea of rural culture, which I'm going to keep putting in quotes and say with a lot of caveats. But we did hear from the experts that we talked with about some similarities across rural communities across the country. And those similarities included the strength and size of rural families. I pointed that research out earlier. Rural older adults had more family members in their life. And historically and currently, rural families do tend to be a little bit bigger than urban families. However, we also heard from the experts that we talked with that in some rural communities, it might be more isolating to feel different. Different in any way, perhaps because of your race or your ethnicity, because of your disability status, your sexual orientation, your gender. whatever it might be, if you feel like you are the only one or one of the only ones in your community, it can be harder to find that group, to find that sense of safety, to find that sense of inclusion. For some people, technology can really help to bridge this divide where you can find people who can understand you, can relate to you online. But again, for rural communities, if you don't have access to the technology that you need, that's not going to be available. And then we also heard about a shift toward being less likely to know one's neighbor and increased political divides in rural communities. When we have time for discussion, I'd love to hear from those of you who've lived in your communities for a long time, whether or not this rings true. I hope that it doesn't. I hope that many of you are not experiencing this, but we're living in such a divisive and divided era. And I think that political activity has only made that worse. I think that COVID-19 pandemic only made that worse. And I'm nervous about what our current election year will do to the social fabric of our communities and how we relate to and acknowledge and trust one another. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area. Okay, so that was a lot of challenges, that was a lot of problems, but I want to come back to the point that I made earlier. Rural communities and older adults and communities in general have so many assets. There are so many things we can do to build up social connection, to address social well-being. And the good news here is that this isn't rocket science. There are some problems, curing cancer, that are incredibly hard to do, incredibly hard. This is not one of them. There are things that we can do. There are things that each one of us here on this webinar can do today to address our own social well-being and to address the social well-being of other people. There are things we can do as communities, and there are things we can do as society in policy to address isolation and loneliness. This gives me a lot of hope. It's really not rocket science here. And I want to come back to that quote that I shared earlier from Surgeon General Murthy, with loneliness being like thirst or like hunger. With thirst and hunger, you take a drink, you have something to eat if you have access to those. Loneliness, we need to do simple things to address our risks and to address others' risks. So I came up here with an incomplete list of ideas of things that we can do individually and as a community. I'm going to run through these, and then I hope we have a little time for each of you to add to these lists and to share what's working for you or what ideas come to mind. First, some individual actions. Start by paying attention to your own feelings with solitude and your need for connection. I think that as a society, we have a harder time with solitude than we used to. I think that technology, I think that social media plays a big role. I think that we are used to more constant stimulation and more constant interaction and being alone with one's thoughts, just sitting in quiet, being isolated in any way can be challenging and can be really healthy. Solitude is good for us. We're not made for constant action, constant connection. But we are made as human beings for some connection. We are social animals, just like the dog here. Dogs are social, humans are social. We fundamentally need to connect with one another to be healthy, to be well. So starting by paying attention to your own needs, both for solitude and for connection. And then there are things you can do to foster connection. Again, it's not challenging. It's not rocket science. Simple things like reaching out to others with phone, an email, a text, a snail mail. I'm a big believer in snail mail. Just about every day I send some snail mail out to someone. Just today I sent 3 notes to 3 different people in various parts of my life saying, I'm thinking of you. It's not a lot, but it can mean a lot for someone to get that, to be on the receiving end of that. I also want to say, I think that sometimes we're worried about how it will be received if we reach out, if we call someone, if we text someone, if we email. What's the other person going to think? Are they going to think that I seem lonely, or does this seem strange? There's actually been research into how people feel when they're the recipient of that kind of social contact. And almost universally, people are appreciative of that contact. They enjoy it, they appreciate it. And I want to come back to the fact that we all experience loneliness at some point, and we all benefit from putting ourselves out there, from connecting with other people. Other thoughts here: use social media constructively. Social media could be its own webinar presentation, and probably should be. There can be really good things about it. It can help us find connection. It can help us find people with similar interests. It can help us arrange ideas for connecting with one another. But it's really best used if it can facilitate more meaningful connection. If you use social media to connect with someone, but then move that into an in-person connection or over the phone or something that's a little bit more substantive. If you're using social media passively just to look at what other people are doing in their lives, it can be extremely harmful. And that's part of why we're seeing the high rates of loneliness and isolation among younger people. You might really have that feeling that you're missing out, that everyone is off having fun without you. And that's not the truth. What we're seeing on social media is everyone's highlight reel, the best moments from people's lives that are heavily curated and filtered. We need to remember that, and we need to use it constructively. That means not being on social media all the time and making sure that it leads to more substantive connection when we do use it. And then it can be really helpful to try out new hobbies, new clubs, new groups, see what's available in your area. A great way to make social connection is to find someone with a similar interest or to learn a new skill, a new hobby. That's one of the best ways from research to spark conversation and to spark connection. Find ways to help others. This also comes from research, serving others, volunteering, finding some way to feel a sense of purpose in the way that you can be of service to someone else is one of the best antidotes to social isolation. And then finally, don't be afraid to talk about it. I think the more that we talk about it, the more that we all admit that sometimes we feel lonely, the more we can address the stigma around this, and the more we can get to solutions and meaningful connection. So those are a long but incomplete list of individual actions. But what can we do as a community, and what can you do as organizations and as programs? Again, I think talking about it, having programs like the one today, having any sort of community conversation that talks about isolation and loneliness and that normalizes it is really important. And then providing opportunities for connection and providing opportunities that are accessible, affordable, that recognize the need for varying schedules. Maybe some people can only join in the evenings. Maybe some people can only join during daylight hours because they don't drive in the evening. Maybe some people can only do weekends. Having a variety of opportunities is important. And then having a variety of interest areas and topics. I think that there are a lot of opportunities out there, and I think there are a lot of good examples, many from area agencies on aging or from local libraries that might hold a book discussion, a puzzle event, a community journaling event, something that appeals to different people for different reasons. And then as community, we also need to think about the built environment where people are able to gather. Do we have safe places that are accessible physically and on a variety of schedules and accessible by transportation? Do we have safe connection points, parks, sidewalks, places for people to walk or connect? Some of that can be really challenging in some of our smaller communities and outlying rural areas. But it's important to think about, if people are coming together physically, where is that happening? And can there be additional spaces? Can we think creatively about the spaces we have? School buildings, stores, gas stations, co-ops. Can we be creative in the places that we gather? And finally, I'm in the Division of Health Policy and Management in the School of Public Health, so I think about policy implications in a lot of what I do. And just a few pretty general thoughts here about policy action. I think there are a lot of policy solutions, especially around transportation and technology and healthcare. But I think any policy action needs to be rural specific, take this context into account, flexible and inclusive. I think it needs to address some of the structural factors that underlie social disconnectedness. And I think policy needs to build on strength in rural areas. One way to do that is by including rural voices and rural perspectives in any policy action. So all of your voices matter, your voices, your perspectives, your expertise matters. And I hope that you're lifting that up. I want to end by sharing a few resources here, and these are all hyperlinked, so they're not very useful to you in the presentation, but hopefully will be very useful to you in the slides that Stephanie will email out. First, the 988 hotline. Hopefully you're all familiar with 988 at this point, but this is the rebranded crisis hotline, suicide prevention hotline. If anything here makes you feel like you want to talk to someone, you're not quite sure how you're doing, you need a connection, you're just not feeling great, 988 can be a good first stopping place and is an important resource to be able to share with others. And then a few other, and there are lots and lots of resources. All of your organizations could be listed here too, but I'm just sharing a few. The Minnesota Department of Health has a really nice repository called Minnesota Thrives that they have been adding to for several years now, and includes lots of examples of community programs that are addressing mental health and social connectedness across the state. Men's Sheds is a really great organization. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. It started outside of the US, but is in the US now, and Minnesota has more men's sheds than any other state in the country. Men's sheds are places where men, retired men in particular, can come together, stand shoulder to shoulder, work on a project, but find some source of connection by being a part of that. That's one really tangible, specific example. There are certainly others out there, and there are others that are open to people who are not men too. The Foundation for Social Connection is a large organization that has a huge repository of programs and ideas and funding mechanisms to address social well-being. And then the Rural Health Information Hub, if you're not familiar with that, that's a wonderful resource-rich website that has information on all things rural health, but including social programming. And it has examples of programs that have thrived across the country and also examples of funding mechanisms. So those are some resources that I wanted to leave you with today. I thank you for being with me to talk about one of my favorite things, and I think I'll stop sharing and see if there are any questions or additional thoughts from the group. I would love to hear if anyone has a program or an idea that has worked in either in your own work or maybe in your personal life to foster social connection. Feel free to drop it in the chat or unmute yourself and share.
I'm off of mute. I can share an example.
Great.
I've taken recordings like this and actually went to community meetings, potlucks and gatherings where they're already at and shown them. So one I did was specifically on scams from the Better Business Bureau. And it was great because after they actually all talked about local scams, things they have been through, and it just offered a space for them to even talk about scams in general and give local support. So kind of unexpected at the end, but really cool to see and just foster that socialization.
I love that. I love that example for so many reasons. I think sometimes offering educational programming that's not related to social connection, it might be on anything, just gives people a chance to come together and connect and get to know each other a little bit more. And I also like that you mentioned potlucks. The one thing I didn't mention here, but I think is really important, is food. We connect with each other over food. It can be such a connecting device, I think, to share about yourself and your culture, but also to share meals with people. I love to bring baked goods to people as one way to connect with people. So thanks for mentioning food. Any other ideas or any questions in general? Oh, I'm seeing one here. Monthly birthday parties, bingo size. I don't know bingo size. Can
Yeah,
anyone
so
tell me what bingo size is? Is it
yep,
exercise and
bingo's,
bingo together?
you got it. Yep, yep. It's a Title III funded program. Yep,
I love
evidence-based.
it.
Yeah,
It's perfect. That's a great example.
it is
And
a
monthly
fun one. I
birthday
watched
parties,
Littell
yes.
actually even lead it, so it is a fun one.
I might need to check out bingo size. And I like the idea of monthly birthday parties. It's so simple and it helps people feel seen. If you're in the February birthday group, it helps you feel seen and known and appreciated. I think it's just really beautiful in its simplicity. Any others?
I'm not seeing any, but that presentation was amazing. I know I took a lot of nuggets from it. The isolation and solitude is great information, and um, just a lot to learn from those two definitions in general. So I want to thank you for being here and taking the time to present to us. And yeah, we will get the slides and we'll upload them onto our website and I'll send them out. Otherwise, if anybody has anything else, they can take themselves off of mute, or you can reach out to me and I can help answer any other questions or send them on. So, well,
Thanks,
thank
Steph.
you very much.
My pleasure. This was fun. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.